It is the 27th of October, 1915, near the bottom of the world. For 10 months, a wooden ship has been frozen fast in the pack ice of the Antarctic, and for weeks the ice has been closing on her like a slow fist. Her timbers are screaming, the hull is being crushed, plank by plank, and there is nothing any man on board can do to stop it. The expedition's leader stands on the ice and watches his ship, his only way home, the warm wooden heart of the whole enterprise, begin to die. And he turns to his men, 28 souls stranded on a floating sheet of frozen sea, and he does not give a speech about the disaster. He says simply, "Ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." As if home were a thing still entirely within reach. His name is Ernest Shackleton. He is an Anglo-Irish explorer in his early 40s, ambitious, charismatic, and by 1914 already famous for his earlier journeys toward the South Pole. In 1914, he launches his most audacious expedition yet, an attempt to make the first crossing of the Antarctic continent on foot, from one side to the other, through the coldest and most lethal landscape on the planet. His ship is a wooden sailing vessel, three-masted, specially built for the ice. Her name, and there has never been a name more tested by events, is the Endurance. On board are 28 men, sailors, scientists, a surgeon, a carpenter, a cook, a photographer. They never reach the continent. In January of 1915, while still working toward their landing point, the Endurance becomes trapped in the pack ice of the Weddell Sea. The ice closes around the hull and holds her completely, like an insect in setting amber. And there she stays. The ice does not release her in a week or a month. It carries the frozen ship helplessly for 10 months, drifting with the pack across the face of the polar sea. And then, in October of 1915, the drifting ice begins to move against itself, vast plates of frozen ocean grinding together with unimaginable force, and the ship is directly in the grinding. The pressure crushes the Endurance. The men offload what they can onto the ice and watch her die. In November, the ice finally lets go of the wreck, and the Endurance slips beneath the surface and is gone. Now stop and understand exactly the situation those 28 men were in, because it is the entire premise of this episode. It is 1915. There is no radio on the expedition capable of reaching the outside world. No one knows where they are, not within hundreds of miles. No rescue is coming because no one alive knows there is anyone to rescue or where. They are standing on a slowly drifting, slowly breaking sheet of frozen seawater, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest human settlement, with the Antarctic winter as a permanent fact of their lives. They have some tents, some sledges, 3 small open lifeboats salvaged from the ship, dwindling food, and the dogs. That is the whole inventory of their hope. By every reasonable assessment of the situation, in October of 1915, all 28 of those men should have died. This episode is about the discipline by which not one of them did. Shackleton never read the Stoics, as far as we know. He was not a philosopher. He was a working explorer with a gift for leading men. But what he did on the ice, instinctively, under the worst pressure imaginable, was an almost perfect enactment of the central Stoic discipline, the one this whole channel is built on. And seeing it in him, in action, in the cold, teaches the discipline better than any treatise. The discipline is the dividing line. Some things are up to us, some things are not. And the entire question of survival for those 28 men turned out to hang on which side of that line Shackleton chose to put his crew's attention. Look at what was in the second column. the column of things not up to them on the day the ship was crushed. Almost everything: the temperature, the Antarctic winter, the behavior of the ice, the fact of the wreck itself, that was done, finished, beyond appeal, the distance to safety, whether anyone in the world knew they existed, whether the ice they stood on would hold or split, the weather of the months to come. If those men had spent their mental strength on that column, on the catastrophe, on the unfairness, on the rescue that was not coming, on the thousand things that were now simply true and could not be changed, they would have been spending their strength on weather. And in that environment, a man whose strength is spent has very little time left to live. And here is the thing the historical record shows, again and again, that Shackleton did. He relentlessly, deliberately, every single day, pulled his men's attention off the second column and onto the first. He did not let the camp dwell on the lost ship. He named their floating ice camp something almost grimly cheerful and got everyone using the name. He kept the men busy, not with pointless work, but with the genuine first column work of survival: hunting seals, rationing and organizing the food, maintaining the boats, caring for the dogs, drying gear, the daily, controllable, doable tasks. He instituted routines, regular meals, eaten together. He had the men sing in the evenings. He moved skeptics and complainers into his own tent where he could keep their mood from infecting the rest. He understood, without ever using the words, exactly what Epictetus taught: that you have a finite amount of attention and energy, and that the whole art of surviving a catastrophe is to refuse to spend that finite fund on the things you cannot change, and to pour all of it instead into the few things you still can. Let me make the principle concrete, because it is far closer to an ordinary life than an ice floe. Think about any genuine catastrophe in a life: the sudden loss, the diagnosis, the wreck of a plan years in the making. In the hours after it lands, the mind does a very specific and very destructive thing. It runs obsessively on the second column. It rehearses the unfairness. It relitigates how it happened. It demands a rescue, an undoing, a return to before, none of which is available. It pours the entire emotional fortune into a market that has already closed. And Shackleton's discipline, the one that kept 28 men alive, is the deliberate, effortful interruption of exactly that. It is the act of saying, the wreck is real, the wreck is done, and I am now going to stop spending myself on the wreck. What is still up to me today, in the next hour? There is always something, a small concrete task, a thing that can be organized, a body that can be fed, a piece of the situation that still answers to effort. You find that thing, and you do it, and then you find the next one. Not because the small tasks solve the catastrophe, they do not, but because the alternative, the mind running free on the unchangeable, is the thing that actually kills you. The work on the first column is, quite literally, what keeps a person alive long enough to be saved. After the ship was crushed, the men's situation settled into a long, strange, terrible waiting. They were camped on the ice itself, on a great floating raft of frozen seawater, drifting slowly with the current. And their plan, such as it was, depended on that drift carrying them over many months, close enough to land or open water to make a move possible. So for months, the central activity of the expedition was, in a sense, to do nothing dramatic at all, to wait, to camp on the ice and survive each day, and let the slow drift do its work, and not panic, and not waste themselves, and not break. And waiting, it turns out, is one of the very hardest disciplines a human being can be asked to perform, because waiting is where the mind turns on itself. Action, even desperate action, at least feels like agency. But Shackleton's men were asked for long stretches to simply endure, to remain on a drifting floe with no power to speed it, no certainty it would carry them anywhere survivable, and no way to know how long it would take. This is the exact condition the Stoics studied most carefully. It is the condition Seneca wrote about, the suffering of a future that has not arrived, the misery of anticipation. It is the condition that, much later, would kill the optimists in the Hanoi prison, the men who staked their survival on a date. A man on that ice floe who said to himself, "We will reach land by spring," and then watched spring fail to deliver land, was a man in real danger, not from the ice, but from the collapse of his own borrowed hope. And so Shackleton did, on the ice, the thing the Stoics taught in their schools. He shrank his men's horizon deliberately down to a survivable size. He did not let them live in the enormous, unbearable question, will we ever get home? And when? That question had no answer, and living inside an unanswerable question is corrosive. Instead, he ruled the camp on the principle of the single day. Today's seal hunt, today's ration, today's repair, today's meal eaten together on time, tonight's songs. He kept the men focused on the unit of time they could actually control and actually complete, the day in front of them. And he kept the vast, unanswerable future firmly out of the daily conversation of the camp. This is one of the deepest of all Stoic techniques, and Shackleton ran an entire survival operation on it without ever naming it. You cannot endure a year of catastrophe. The year is too big. It will crush you. But you can endure today. Almost anyone can endure today. And a year is survived, when it is survived, as nothing more than a long, unbroken chain of single days, each one handled on its own. In April of 1916, after the men had been on the ice for over a year since the ship was first trapped, the floe they were camped on finally began to break apart beneath them. The long wait was over, not with rescue, but with crisis. The ice could no longer be trusted to hold them. They had to take to the 3 small open lifeboats salvaged from the dead Endurance and commit themselves to the freezing sea. What followed was a brutal 7-day open boat journey through some of the most dangerous water on Earth, frostbitten, soaked, exhausted, hauling at oars in boats meant for nothing like this. And it brought them at last to land, to a bleak, uninhabited spit of rock called Elephant Island, the first solid ground any of them had stood on in 16 months. But Elephant Island was not safety. It was a barren, storm-battered rock, far outside any shipping route, where no vessel would ever pass by chance. To simply wait there was, eventually, to die there. And so Shackleton made the decision that defines him. And it is a decision worth understanding precisely, because it is the dividing line turned into one of the most audacious acts of leadership in recorded history. He chose to take the strongest of the 3 small boats and 5 men, and to sail it, a 22-foot open boat, across 800 miles of the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean, the most violent stretch of sea on the planet, a place of enormous waves and constant gales. The target was a small island called South Georgia, where there were whaling stations and other human beings, and the possibility of rescue. 800 miles of the worst ocean in the world, in an open boat, navigating by brief glimpses of the sun. If they missed the island, The next land was thousands of miles away, and they would simply be lost. Look very carefully at the structure of that decision, because it is the entire philosophy in a single act. Shackleton did not pretend the situation was good. He confronted the brutal fact head on. Elephant Island was a dead end, and waiting passively for a rescue that would never come was simply a slower death. That is the clear-eyed acceptance of the second column, the honest naming of the catastrophe. But he did not stop at acceptance, and this is the part that matters. He then asked the first column question: given this brutal reality, what action is still genuinely available to me? And he found the answer, and the answer was terrifying, and he took it anyway. The boat journey was not optimism. Optimism would have been staying on the rock and hoping. The boat journey was the opposite of that. It was a man looking directly at a hopeless situation and locating, inside the hopelessness, the one remaining thing that was still up to him, and then spending everything, every reserve he had, on that one thing. He could not control the ocean. He could not control whether the tiny boat would survive the gales, but he could control whether the attempt was made, and so he made it. Against odds that are almost impossible to overstate, the small boat made it. After about 2 weeks at sea, in conditions that should, by every reasonable measure, have killed them, Shackleton and his 5 men reached the island of South Georgia. But even then, the ordeal was not finished. They had landed on the wrong, uninhabited side of the island, and to reach the whaling station and help, Shackleton and 2 of the men had to cross the mountainous, glaciated, completely uncharted interior of South Georgia, on foot, without proper equipment, in a single 36-hour push. They did it. They walked, frozen and starving, into a whaling station, and the long silence of the expedition was finally broken. And then Shackleton turned around. He organized the rescue of the men he had left behind, first the boat crew on the far side of South Georgia, and then, after several failed attempts blocked by ice, the 22 men still waiting on Elephant Island. In August of 1916, he reached them. Every one of them was alive. 28 men. Their ship crushed and sunk. 16 months on drifting ice and barren rock. An open boat voyage across the worst ocean on earth. Not one death. And so the obvious question, the one this whole episode has been building toward, is what exactly was the discipline? What did Shackleton actually have? And what is its name? And I want to argue that its name is the one painted on the side of the lost ship: endurance. But endurance is a word we have worn smooth and almost emptied of meaning. So let me say precisely what it is in the Stoic sense, the sense the ancients meant. Endurance is not passive. That is the first and most important thing, and almost everyone gets it wrong. We tend to imagine endurance as a kind of grim, gritted teeth waiting, just bearing it, just absorbing the blows, holding on until something external changes. But that is not what Shackleton did, and it is not what the Stoics meant. The men who simply waited passively for the situation to save them, those are the men in every story on this channel who do not make it. Real endurance, Stoic endurance, is intensely active. It is the disciplined, ongoing, daily decision to keep applying your will to the narrow strip of things that are still up to you, and to keep doing it not for an hour, not for a day, but across a span of time so long that the doing of it becomes the whole of your life. Endurance is the first column discipline, sustained. It is finding today's controllable task and doing it, and then doing it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, through 16 months, without the relief of knowing when or whether it ends. Marcus Aurelius did it for one night at a time in his tent. Stockdale did it one morning at a time in his cell. Shackleton did it one day at a time on the ice. It is the same discipline. Endurance is simply that discipline, extended. The refusal, repeated until it becomes a way of life, to stop acting on the part of the situation that still answers to you. And now I have to put the honest objection to this, because there is one. You might say, Shackleton succeeded, every man lived. It is easy to call his decisions wise when they are crowned with a miracle. But what if the boat had been lost? What if the ice had taken them all? Would the discipline still have been the right one then? And the answer, and it is the heart of the Stoic position, is yes, unchanged. Because the discipline was never a guarantee of the outcome. The Stoics are completely clear about this, and so was Shackleton. The ocean does not answer to anyone's will. The boat genuinely might have been lost. The outcome was always, fully, in the second column. The discipline is not a technique for controlling results. It is a decision about how a person will conduct themselves while the results remain unknown and uncontrollable. Shackleton's greatness is not that the boat survived. That, in part, was fortune. His greatness is that, facing a situation that gave him every excuse for despair, he chose to keep acting on the one ridge of ground that was still his, all the way to the end. That choice was admirable on the morning he made it, before anyone knew, before anyone could know, how the sea would answer. The miracle confirmed the discipline. It did not create it. The discipline would have been right, even in a story that ended in ice. So how does a person actually use this without an ice floe, without an open boat? Because almost no one listening will be shipwrecked in the Antarctic. But almost everyone at some point will face the real subject of this episode, a hardship that is not a single dramatic blow, but a long, grinding, open-ended siege. The illness that does not resolve, the recovery measured in years, the hard season of a life that simply will not end on schedule. And for all of those, Shackleton's endurance is a practice, and it is concrete, and it is small. First, shrink the horizon on purpose. When you are inside a long hardship, the mind insists on living in the enormous question. How long will this last? Will it ever end? How will I possibly survive months or years of this? And that question is genuinely unsurvivable because it has no answer and it is too big to hold. Shackleton's first act of leadership was to take that question off the table. He did not let his camp live in the year. He made them live in the day. So do that deliberately. When the vast question rises, and it will many times a day, set it down. Not by pretending it does not exist, but by replacing it with the only question that is actually yours to answer. Not, how do I survive all of this? But, what does today, this single day, actually require of me? That question has an answer. The big one does not. Second, find today's seal hunt. Shackleton kept his men alive partly by keeping them genuinely, purposefully busy, not with make work, but with the real, concrete, controllable tasks of survival. The hunt, the repair, the ration, the shared meal. Inside any long hardship, there are always first column tasks, small, real, doable things that genuinely answer to your effort. The body that can be cared for today, the one piece of the situation that can be organized, the meal made properly, the small repair. These tasks do not solve the catastrophe. Shackleton's seal hunts did not get anyone off the ice, but they do something just as essential. They give the will a place to act every single day, and a will with a place to act stays strong while a will with nothing to do turns on itself and corrodes. Find the task, do the task. The doing of small, real, controllable things is not a distraction from surviving a long hardship. It is, quite precisely, how a long hardship is survived. And third, protect the morale of the camp, including your own. Shackleton understood that despair is contagious, and so is steadiness. He sang with his men. He kept routines. He ate with them. He moved the most negative voices close to himself, where their gloom could be contained rather than allowed to spread through the whole expedition. You have a camp too, even if it is only your own household, your own few people, your own inner life. And the principle holds at every scale. Steadiness is something you can deliberately generate and deliberately protect through routine, through small shared rituals, through the ordinary structure of a normal day, kept normal in abnormal times. Shackleton's evening songs on the ice were not frivolous. They were survival equipment, as real as the boats. The maintenance of morale, the daily deliberate tending of the human spirit, yours and the people's around you, is itself a first column task. It answers to effort, and in a long hardship, it is one of the most important tasks there is. It would be dishonest to end without naming the hard part. Because Shackleton's story, told carelessly, becomes a simple and slightly false anthem, the triumphant tale where willpower conquers everything, where a strong enough leader and a good enough attitude guarantee that everyone comes home. And that is not the lesson. And it is worth refusing plainly, because the false version is genuinely harmful. It tells people that if their hardship does not end well, they must not have endured hard enough. And that is a cruelty, and it is not true. The honest truth is that the outcome was never guaranteed, and Shackleton knew it. Fortune was a real factor. The boat could have been lost. A storm could have ended everything. The Antarctic has killed many expeditions led by brave and disciplined men, and being brave and disciplined did not save them. Even Shackleton's own record is not spotless. On a separate part of the very same expedition, a supporting team operating on the other side of the continent did suffer deaths. The polar world does not award survival to whoever has the best attitude. So the endurance this episode honors was never a technique for controlling the outcome. It cannot do that. Nothing can do that. What endurance actually is, all it ever was, is a way of conducting yourself with steadiness and dignity and useful action through a hardship whose ending you do not control and cannot see. It does not promise you the rescue. It promises you only this, that whatever the sea finally decides, you will have spent your strength on the part that was yours and not squandered it in despair on the part that never was. You endure the long day, you act on what is yours, and you hold the outcome with an open hand. That is the teaching. Everything else is commentary. Ernest Shackleton brought all 28 men of the Endurance home alive, and the achievement is so improbable that it has never stopped being told. He died a few years later, in 1922, of a heart attack aboard a ship at the start of yet another polar expedition. And at his wife's wish, he was buried on the island of South Georgia, the very island his impossible boat journey had reached. He lies, by his own kind of logic, at the far end of the hardest thing he ever did. The ship that carried his men south was named Endurance before any of them knew what the word would be made to mean. By the end, the name had become the entire story. And that is why he belongs on this channel, beside the philosophers who never saw ice. Because Shackleton is the proof that the Stoic discipline is not a thing you do with your mind in a quiet room. It is a thing that can be done with cold hands, on a breaking floe, in command of frightened men, with every external fact arrayed against you. He never read Epictetus. He did not need to. He had worked out, under the worst pressure his century could apply, the same truth the Roman slave had taught, that you cannot govern the ice or the ocean or the outcome, and that your whole strength, all of it, must therefore go to the one ridge of ground that is still yours. He spent his strength there for 16 months, and he brought them home. And you do not need a shipwreck to use this. You only need to be a person somewhere inside a long, hard, open-ended siege of your own, and willing today to do what Shackleton did on the ice, to set down the enormous, unanswerable question and pick up the small, answerable one. What does this single day require? To find today's real, controllable task and do it. To tend the morale of your small camp and your own spirit on purpose, and then to do it again tomorrow and the day after, enduring not by gritting your teeth and waiting, but by acting steadily, daily, with an open hand toward the outcome, on the one narrow strip of the world that was always and only yours to move. Stone and iron. Thank you for sitting with this one. If essays like this are useful to you, the channel is here for them. Subscribe if you want more.